Today, we're diving into why it actually sucked to be a medieval assassin and why history often leaves out the brutal, lonely reality behind the myths. Forget the romantic cloaks and dramatic escapes. The truth is darker, harsher, and far more human than most stories admit. If you enjoy slow, immersive history that reveals the lives people didn't want to live, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments side. Love to hear what part of medieval life you think was most unforgiving. And when this video ends, check out the other stories on the channel exploring the hidden suffering behind history's most dangerous roles. Now, step quietly into the shadows and let's begin. Imagine being trained to kill in the shadows, but never earning glory, wealth, or safety in return. No medals, no legends, just fear, secrecy, and a very short life expectancy. When people imagine a medieval assassin, they often picture someone who chose this life. Someone sharp, confident, dangerous. A man who woke up one day, stretched, and thought, yes, today I will become a professional killer. That version is comforting. It suggests control. The truth was much quieter and much worse. Most medieval assassins did not arrive at this role through ambition. They arrived through erosion, one loss at a time. A bad harvest, a lost war, a debt that grew teeth, a winter that lasted just a little too long. In the Middle Ages, very few people had the luxury of choosing what they became. You were born into a role, and that role held on tightly. If you were born poor, the ladder upward was mostly decorative. It existed, technically, but very few ever climbed it. Most just leaned against it and hoped. Many future assassins began as soldiers, not the celebrated knights with banners and armor, but the disposable kind. Men handed a spear, told where to stand, and forgotten the moment the fighting stopped. When wars ended, these men returned home carrying injuries, habits, and no clear place in civilian life. They knew how to hurt people. They did not know how to plow a field with a bad leg. Others came from domestic service, stable hands, porters, household guards, people who moved quietly through noble spaces but never belonged to them. They learned routines, schedules, who slept where, which doors were locked, and which were only pretending. When dismissed, unpaid, or accused of something they did not do, this knowledge stayed with them. Knowledge, in hard times, has a way of becoming dangerous. Some came from outright criminal life. Thieves, smugglers, extortionists. The medieval underworld was small, informal, and constantly hungry. A man who had already crossed one line often found the next line closer than expected, especially if someone richer was willing to pay. And payment mattered, because hunger mattered. Medieval Europe was not stable. Famine was not a rare disaster. It was a regular visitor. Crops failed. Weather shifted. Wars trampled fields into mud. A single bad season could undo an entire family. Once you lost your land or tools, getting them back was almost impossible. Debt followed fast, and debt was not gentle. There was no social safety net, no second chances office, no quiet reset button. If you could not work, you begged. If begging failed, you stole. If stealing failed, you ran. And if running failed, you took whatever work would have you. Assassination was rarely advertised as such. No one walked around medieval towns shouting, "Now hiring killers." It came disguised as favors, as errands, as whispered conversations in taverns where the fire was low and the ale was cheap. Someone always knew someone. Someone always had a problem that needed solving quietly. And quietly did not mean gently. It meant without paperwork. The people who took these offers were not fearless. They were cornered. They understood the risks very well. Medieval people were not naive about death. They lived next to it. They buried children. They watched neighbors disappear. They knew exactly what happened to men caught doing violent work outside the law. They also knew what happened to men who starved. Social mobility, as a concept, barely existed. You could not train into a new class. You could not rebrand yourself. Your reputation followed you like a shadow, and shadows in medieval towns were long. Once labeled dangerous, untrustworthy, or criminal, doors closed. Guilds would not accept you. Churches watched you closely. Employers avoided you. Ironically, this made assassination one of the few paths still open. It did not require references. It did not care about your past. In fact, a bad reputation sometimes helped. If people already feared you, that fear could be rented. This did not make assassins powerful. It made them useful. And usefulness in the Middle Ages was temporary. There is a tendency to imagine assassins as outsiders, but many were deeply woven into their communities before things fell apart. They had families, neighbors, faces that were known. This made their later lives even lonelier. They could not return openly. They could not explain themselves. They existed in a strange middle state, recognized but not welcomed. And unlike soldiers, they were not protected by banners or causes. No one sang songs about them. No one paid their widow a pension. If they died, they were simply gone. Importantly, assassination was not a stable profession. There was no ladder, no senior rank, no mentorship program. Each job was a gamble taken by someone who knew this might be the last thing they ever did. Not in a dramatic way, in a practical way. Many assassins did not even see themselves as assassins. They saw themselves as men doing one terrible thing to survive another month. They told themselves it was temporary. Just this once. Just until spring. Just until the debt was paid. Spring, unfortunately, kept being late. If this sounds less like a criminal mastermind story and more like a slow collapse, that is because it usually was. Medieval assassination was rarely the beginning of a dark career. It was closer to the end of a narrowing road. The humor, if there is any, comes from how history later dressed this up. Chroniclers turned desperation into drama, fear into legend. Men who could not escape their circumstances became symbols of shadowy menace. It is easier to fear a villain than to acknowledge a system that creates them. So when we talk about who became an assassin in the Middle Ages, the answer is uncomfortable. It was not the bold. It was not the clever. It was not the ambitious. It was the tired, the injured, the indebted, the men who ran out of exits. And once they stepped into that role, even briefly, there was no stepping back out. In the next chapter, we will look at one of the biggest lies ever told about these people, that they belonged to secret guilds, brotherhoods, or protective networks, because most of them were alone. And alone, in medieval life, was the most dangerous position of all. If medieval assassins had guilds, their meetings would have been very short, mostly because they did not exist. Popular culture loves the idea of secret brotherhoods, hooded figures, oaths spoken in candlelight, rules, ranks, maybe matching cloaks if the budget allows. It is a comforting image. It suggests order, structure, protection. Medieval life, however, was not kind to neat systems, especially illegal ones. With a few rare and very specific exceptions, most medieval assassins did not belong to anything resembling a guild. No organization, no central authority, no emergency contact if things went wrong. The idea of a widespread professional assassin network is a later invention, stitched together by rumor, fear, and writers who enjoyed a good shadow. In reality, medieval crime was fragmented, small, local, personal criminal networks existed, but they were unstable and constantly collapsing under pressure. There was no safe infrastructure for something as risky as assassination. Keeping secrets required trust, and trust was expensive. Most assassins worked alone. If they did not, they worked through a single intermediary, a fixer, a broker, someone who knew how to whisper in the right taverns and disappear when needed. These intermediaries were not loyal partners, they were buffers. If something went wrong, the assassin was the one who absorbed the consequences. Guilds in the Middle Ages were legal bodies. They required charters, public rules, and visible membership. Even thieves' guilds, as imagined today, would have been almost impossible to maintain long-term. City authorities, church officials, and rival criminals all watched closely. Anything to organize drew attention. Attention led to raids. Raids led to confessions. Confessions, as we will see later, were rarely voluntary. The lack of organization meant assassins had no safety net, no one to hide them, no shared resources, no lawyers, obviously. If you were caught, you were alone. If you were betrayed, there was no counsel to appeal to. If payment was withheld, there was no enforcement mechanism. This isolation made betrayal not just possible, but likely. Clients understood this very well. Hiring an assassin who worked alone meant fewer loose ends, except the assassin himself. And loose ends had a habit of being cut. Assassins also did not trust each other. They competed for the same scarce opportunities. They feared infiltration. They feared informants. They feared being recognized. Even sharing information carried risk. A name spoken in the wrong place could travel faster than you. So instead of brotherhoods, there were rumors, stories about other killers who maybe existed, men who were said to have done terrible things and survived. These stories offered comfort. If someone else had done this and lived, maybe you could too. Most of the time, those stories were incomplete or exaggerated. or ended badly, just not in the part people liked to repeat. Without guilds, training was informal. You learned by doing, or by watching, or by failing. There were no manuals, no standardized techniques. Every assassin improvised based on what they knew, what they had, and what they could afford. This made outcomes unpredictable. It also meant mistakes were common. If an assassin was injured, there was no communal care, no shared doctor, no place to recover quietly. An injured assassin was a visible problem. Limping attracted attention. So did scars. So did sudden changes in behavior. Isolation also meant paranoia. Many assassins slept poorly. They moved often. They trusted almost no one. Loneliness was not a side effect, it was the job. Maintaining secrecy required emotional distance. Friendships faded. Family contact became dangerous. And yet, total isolation was impossible. People still needed food, shelter, and information. Every interaction was a risk calculation. Was this unsafe? Was this priest curious or suspicious? Was this stranger actually a guard pretending to be drunk? Guilds usually exist to reduce risk. Assassins had none, so risk remained high at all times. The famous exception often raised here is the so-called Hashashanyan, whose reputation traveled far beyond their actual reach. European chroniclers heard about them secondhand, often from enemies, and filled in the blanks with imagination. The result was a myth of a disciplined, mystical order of killers who acted with unity and purpose. What most European assassins heard instead was the rumor, stripped of context. Some killers somewhere have protection. This made their own reality feel even harsher by comparison. But for the average medieval assassin in Europe, there was no shared ideology, no cause, no sense of belonging. There were tools, briefly useful, easily discarded. Even criminal communities avoided them. Thieves preferred stealth. Smugglers preferred invisibility. Assassins brought heat. Once blood was spilled, authorities reacted differently. Murder threatened order in a way theft did not. Associating with a known killer made everyone nervous. So assassins floated on the edges of society. Too dangerous to trust, too useful to ignore, too expendable to protect. The humor, again, lies in contrast. Later stories turned this loneliness into mystique. Cloaks became symbols. Silence became discipline. Fear became power. In reality, silence came from necessity, not confidence. Fear was not something assassins inspired, it was something they lived inside. Without guilds, assassins had no shared memory, no preserved lessons. Each generation relearned the same brutal truths. Each man thought he might be the exception, that he would be careful enough, smart enough, lucky enough. Luck, unfortunately, was not a strategy, and because there was no organization to negotiate on their behalf, assassins entered every agreement from a position of weakness. This will matter greatly when we talk about how jobs were arranged, promises were made, and payments quietly disappeared. Because when you have no guild, no allies, and no protection, every contract is one-sided. Which brings us to the next chapter, because the work itself was dangerous, but the deal was often worse. If medieval assassins had contracts, they were very short, mostly because they existed only in the air. There were no documents, no signatures, no witnesses who would later admit they were witnesses. Everything was spoken quietly, often indirectly, and sometimes not spoken at all. A nod, a phrase, a suggestion that something unfortunate needed to stop happening. This was not a system designed for fairness. It was designed for deniability. Assassination agreements were usually verbal, arranged through intermediaries or chance meetings. A man would be told where to be, when not to be seen, and what outcome was expected. Payment was discussed vaguely, enough to survive, enough to risk it, rarely enough to retire anywhere pleasant. And once the agreement was made, it could not be enforced. If the assassin succeeded and returned for payment, the client might suddenly forget details, or claim dissatisfaction, or insist that the job was done incorrectly. There was no appeals process for killing not performed to expectations. Sometimes payment was delayed, sometimes reduced, sometimes it never came at all, and sometimes payment came with guards. Clients understood something important. The assassin could not complain. Going to authorities was not an option. Publicly demanding payment would only confirm guilt. Violence against the client would make things worse. The assassin had already crossed the line. Crossing it again rarely improved the situation. So many assassins were cheated, regularly. In some cases, the job itself was a trap. The client never intended to pay. They intended to remove a rival and then remove the person who could connect them to the act. Killing the assassin solved two problems at once. This was not seen as cruel. It was seen as efficient. Assassins knew this, or learned it quickly. Every job carried two risks: being caught and being erased afterward. Neither outcome was good. One simply happened later. There were no standard rates, no going price for murder. Value depended on the target, the urgency, and the assassin's perceived usefulness. A poor assassin was cheaper and more disposable. A skilled one cost more, but also scared the client more. Fear did not protect the assassin. It encouraged silence. Most deals were structured so that the assassin needed the payment immediately: food, shelter, or debt relief. This urgency weakened their position. A hungry man cannot negotiate calmly. Clients knew this and used it. There was also no clarity about expectations. Did the client want death immediately, publicly, quietly? Could witnesses be tolerated? These details were often left unclear on purpose. Ambiguity gave the client flexibility later to claim failure. Assassins worked without guarantees, and everyone involved knew it. The humor, if we can call it that, lies in how seriously later stories treat these arrangements. They imagine precision, planning, mutual respect between killer and employer. In reality, most agreements were closer to bad bar deals made at midnight by people who would not trust each other with a spoon. Assassins had no bargaining power because they had no future leverage. Once the job was done, their usefulness dropped sharply. A living assassin knew too much. A dead one knew nothing. Even intermediaries offered little protection. These middlemen were loyal only to survival. If pressured, they talked. If paid more, they switched sides. If threatened, they vanished. An assassin trusting an intermediary was trusting a man who specialized in not being there when trouble arrived. And trouble almost always arrived. Some assassins tried to secure partial payment up front. This helped slightly. It did not change the structure. If the client wanted them gone afterward, that still happened. Sometimes the advance payment was simply the price of bait. There was also the issue of false promises. Clients would imply future work, continued protection, ongoing patronage. This was rarely real. It was a way to keep the assassin cooperative and hopeful. Hope, in this case, was another tool. Assassins were often sent into unfamiliar towns with little support. No safe house, no allies, no escape arranged. They were expected to improvise and disappear on their own. If they failed alone. Even success did not guarantee safety. Rumors spread. People talked. Someone always noticed something strange, and the client, now anxious, became a potential enemy. The lack of written contracts also meant memory became weaponized. Who said what? Who promised how much? Who changed the terms? With no record, the stronger party controlled the narrative. That party was never the assassin. This environment bred paranoia. Assassins questioned everything. Was the target real? Was the information accurate? Was the guard's schedule correct or intentionally wrong? Was the escape route safe or leading somewhere very public? Clients sometimes fed false information deliberately. A confused assassin was easier to catch, easier to blame, easier to remove. It is important to understand that this cruelty was not accidental. It was structural. The system worked because it was merciless. Everyone involved accepted that. Assassins did not expect fairness. They hoped for luck. And luck, as we will keep seeing, had a short attention span. Some assassins tried to protect themselves by being unpredictable, changing plans, acting early, acting late. This sometimes worked. Sometimes it made things worse. Deviating from expectations could anger the client. Angered clients had resources, so the assassin walked a narrow path. Obey too closely and be disposable. Deviate too much and be hunted. There was no winning strategy, only survival, job by job. And this imbalance shaped everything else about medieval assassination. It affected how tools were chosen, how risks were taken, and how quickly things went wrong. When you know you might not be paid, or might not survive payment, you rush. You improvise. You accept shortcuts. Which brings us to the next chapter. Because when the deal itself is broken, the tools you use tend to be broken too, and medieval tools were rarely forgiving. If medieval assassins had a weapons catalogue, it would have been disappointing. There were no perfectly balanced daggers made for silent work, no custom blades hidden in velvet cases, no specialized tools designed for clean, efficient killing. Most assassins used whatever they could afford, steal, or carry without drawing attention. which was usually not much. Weapons in the Middle Ages were expensive. Good steel required skilled labor, time, and money. Assassins, as we have already seen, rarely had extra money. They were not investing in their craft. They were surviving from one risk to the next. So the tools were often poor. Knives were the most common choice. They were easy to hide and easy to explain. A knife could be a tool, a utensil, or a sign of honest work. But medieval knives were inconsistent. The metal quality varied wildly. Blades bent, edges dulled quickly, handles loosened. A strong strike could snap a cheap knife in half. This was not dramatic. It was terrifying. An assassin whose knife failed mid-attack did not get a second chance. They were suddenly unarmed, exposed, and very visible. Even a moment of surprise could turn fatal if the target fought back or if someone nearby noticed. Crossbows were sometimes used, especially for distance kills. They were accurate enough, but slow. Reloading took time. Bolts could misfire. Strings snapped. A crossbow that failed once was useless under pressure, and carrying one through a town made secrecy difficult. There were also blunt weapons, clubs, hammers, improvised objects. These were not elegant. They were heavy and unpredictable. Killing with blunt force took effort and time. Time was the enemy. Noise was worse. Many assassins carried multiple tools, not out of professionalism, but fear. If one failed, maybe another would work. This added weight and complexity. Dropped weapons were common. So were injuries caused by fumbling in the dark. And then there was armor. Targets, especially important ones, often wore some form of protection. Even light padding could turn a shallow cut into nothing more than an insult. Assassins needed force, accuracy, and luck to strike vulnerable areas. Missing once could mean missing forever. The physical danger to the assassin was constant. A slip, a misjudged step, a broken weapon. These were not small mistakes. They ended lives quickly. It is worth noting that medieval medicine was not kind to injuries. A deep cut, even self-inflicted, could become infected. Many assassins survived the job, only to die days later from wounds they thought were minor. A splintered blade left fragments behind. Dirty metal met open flesh. Fever followed. There were no quiet clinics for assassins. Poisons, which we will discuss in detail next, were often carried in crude containers. Spilled poison was just as dangerous to the assassin as the target. Dosage mistakes were common. Handling toxic substances without protection required care that many could not afford to practice. Even clothing worked against them. Loose sleeves caught on door handles. Cloaks tangled underfoot. Boots slipped on wet stone streets. Darkness hid dangers as well as faces. None of this matched the later image of smooth, effortless killing. Medieval assassination was clumsy, awkward, full of improvisation. It relied less on skill than on timing and chance. The humor here is quiet and dark. Imagine planning the most dangerous act of your life, using tools that might break if you gripped them too hard. Imagine trusting your survival to metal that might not survive the moment. Assassins often tested their weapons beforehand. Cutting wood, piercing cloth. This helped a little. It did not guarantee anything. The stress of real violence changed everything. Hands shook, muscles tensed, precision faded. Some assassins tried to improve their odds by choosing familiar tools. A butcher might use a cleaver, a carpenter a hammer. Familiarity helped with confidence, if not effectiveness. But these tools were not designed for silence. Noise was deadly. A dropped knife on stone could echo down a street. A shouted curse could bring witnesses. Once attention was drawn, escape became unlikely. Tools that required strength also required time. Time invited interruption. It is also important to remember that many assassins were injured before they ever acted. Old war wounds, broken fingers, damaged joints. These limited strength and speed. Tools did not adapt to the body. The body adapted poorly to the tools. And yet, despite all this, people still imagine medieval assassins as precise professionals. This says more about us than about them. We prefer violence when it looks controlled. We are uncomfortable with violence that is messy, uncertain, and clearly desperate. The reality is that many assassins hurt themselves as often as their targets. Cuts, sprains, falls. These injuries slowed them down afterward, making escape harder. A limping man was noticeable. A bleeding one even more so. Tools left traces. Broken blades could be traced to workshops. Unusual weapons attracted attention. Even common knives could be recognized by neighbors. There was no such thing as a clean forensic break. Communities remembered objects. All of this meant that assassination was not just dangerous, it was unreliable. Plans failed because tools failed. Assassins adjusted by rushing. Rushing increased mistakes. Mistakes increased exposure. This cycle repeated over and over. When you combine bad tools with bad contracts and no protection, you get outcomes that are rarely clean. This is why poison became so appealing in theory. It promised distance, delay, plausible innocence. In practice, poison brought its own problems, and many of them were worse. So in the next chapter, we will talk about the most misunderstood weapon of medieval assassination, because poison was not subtle. It was slow, unpredictable, and very good at ruining everyone's plans. Poison sounds elegant. That is the problem. In stories, poison is quiet and clever. A few drops, a sip of wine. A man clutches his throat and collapses, while the assassin watches from a safe distance, already halfway to another country. Medieval poison did not behave like that. It was slow, it was messy, and it had a habit of disappointing everyone involved. Poisons were attractive to assassins because they promised distance. No struggle, no blood, no witnesses staring directly at your face. In theory, poison allowed the killer to vanish before anything happened. In reality, poison required patience, and patience was dangerous. Medieval poisoners worked with limited knowledge. There were no standardized recipes, no reliable measurements, no clear understanding of how long substances took to act or how different bodies would react. Everything was guesswork, based on rumor, trial, and the occasional unfortunate experiment. Common poisons included arsenic, belladonna, and hemlock. Each came with problems. Arsenic was popular because it was hard to detect. It also tasted unpleasant and often caused long, drawn-out illness rather than quick death. Victims vomited, they weakened, they lingered. This gave them time to talk. Belladonna could cause confusion and hallucinations. It could also fail entirely if the dose was too low, too high, and the poisoner might expose themselves just by handling it. Hemlock was famous, but unreliable. Preparation mattered, storage mattered, timing mattered. Miss one detail, and the result changed. There was no safe margin. Dosage was the greatest challenge. Medieval assassins did not know body weight in any meaningful way. They did not account for tolerance, health, or what the victim had eaten that day. A meal could dilute poison. Wine could mask it or make it stronger. Nothing was consistent. So poisoners guessed. Sometimes the poison was not strong enough. The victim became ill, recovered, and began asking questions. Sometimes the poison worked too slowly. The assassin had already fled, assuming success, only to learn later that the target survived. And sometimes the poison killed the wrong person. Food was shared. Cups were passed. Servants tasted dishes. Assassins had little control once the poison left their hands. If an innocent person died, suspicion did not fade. It grew. Poison also left traces, not chemical ones, but social ones. Sudden illness among the wealthy was noticed. Patterns were discussed. Doctors, such as they were, examined symptoms. Even without modern science, people recognized when something was wrong. Poisoning rarely stayed secret. Another problem was access. Poison needed delivery. Into food, into drink, onto skin. This required proximity. The assassins still needed to get close, often pretending to be a servant, a guest, or a trusted figure. This meant repeated exposure to the environment and the people. Repeated exposure meant recognition, and poison had a habit of turning back on its handler. Containers leaked, powders spilled, hands touched faces. Accidental ingestion happened. Many poisoners fell ill themselves. Some died without ever knowing whether the target was affected. There is something darkly ironic about planning a distant killing and dying alone from your own tools. Poison also removed control over timing. A blade acted immediately. Poison acted when it felt like it. This made planning escape difficult. If the assassin left too early, suspicion might never connect them, or it might. If they stayed too long, they risked being nearby when symptoms appeared. Neither option was comfortable. And then there was the issue of confession. Poison victims often remained conscious. They spoke. They named names. Even guesses could be deadly. An accusation did not need proof. It needed momentum. If a victim survived, the danger multiplied. Survivors were angry. They demanded answers. They pressured authorities. They remembered who had access. Poison failed often enough that many assassins preferred physical violence despite its risks. At least a knife told you immediately whether the job was done. Poison left you wondering, Clients did not care about these difficulties. They wanted results, quiet ones. If poison failed, the assassin bore the blame. Not the substance, not the plan, the assassin. This made poison a gamble layered on top of an already dangerous job. The humor here is subtle. Poison is often treated as the smart choice. In reality, it required trust in substances that did not care about your plans. It turned murder into a waiting game played against chance, biology, and rumor. Some assassins tried to improve reliability by increasing dosage. This made detection easier. Others mixed poisons, hoping to cover weaknesses. This often backfired. Symptoms became obvious. Suspicion grew. Poison also tied the assassin to the crime, longer than any blade. Even after leaving, they worried. Did it work? Did someone else fall ill? Did the victim recover and start naming suspects? The mental strain was heavy. Assassins lived in the days after a poisoning with no certainty. Every knock sounded louder. Every rumor felt closer. And unlike physical attacks, poison invited moral panic. Communities feared it deeply. Poison was invisible. Anyone could be a poisoner. This fear led to overreaction. Investigations widened. Innocent people were accused. Confessions were forced. When poison was suspected, authorities acted harshly. For assassins, this meant increased risk long after the act. A stabbing might be resolved quickly. A poisoning lingered. It haunted households. It spread fear. Fear demanded answers. Poison also required planning that many assassins could not sustain. They lacked safe storage. They lacked privacy. They lacked time. Many lived in shared spaces where secrecy was impossible. So despite its reputation, poison was often a last resort, or a mistake made in desperation. It promised elegance and delivered anxiety. In the end, poison did not make assassination safer. It only changed the shape of the danger, and whether through blade or toxin, one thing remained constant. Someone almost always saw something. Which brings us to the next chapter. Because no matter how carefully an assassin planned, medieval life was crowded, noisy, and deeply observant. And killing in private was far harder than killing quietly. Medieval cities were not quiet places. This is important because many assassination plans depended on the idea of privacy. A silent corner, a moment alone, a clean opportunity where no one noticed anything unusual. That idea rarely survived contact with reality. Medieval towns were crowded, tight, and constantly moving. Streets were narrow, houses leaned inward, sounds traveled, smells traveled even farther. People lived close together because they had to. Privacy was a luxury few could afford. Even the wealthy were rarely alone. Servants moved in and out of rooms. Guards shifted positions. Neighbors watched windows out of habit. Children played in places modern adults would never consider safe or private. Everyone knew everyone else's routines, at least roughly. This made secrecy difficult. Markets were the heart of daily life. They were loud, busy, and unavoidable. If someone wanted to meet, trade, eat, or be seen, the market was where it happened. This also made it a commonplace for violence. Crowds offered cover. Chaos could be useful, but crowds also watched. People noticed arguments, sudden movements, raised voices. A man falling, a scream, even a short one, carried attention instantly. Medieval people were not passive observers. When something went wrong, they looked. Churches were another common setting. They offered predictable routines, regular attendance, moments of stillness. But they were also public spaces filled with witnesses. Even prayer happened collectively. Silence did not mean solitude. Taverns, inns, and bathhouses added their own problems. They were social spaces. People talked. They drank. They remembered faces. A stranger stood out, especially one who came and went at odd hours. Assassins often relied on disguise or blending in. This worked only briefly. Medieval communities were close-knit. New faces were noticed. Old faces behaving strangely were noticed even more. The idea of slipping in unseen and slipping out unnoticed was far more fantasy than fact. Even when an assassination happened inside a home, it was rarely private. Homes were shared spaces. Families slept together. Servants slept nearby. Walls were thin. Doors creaked. A struggle, however brief, could wake others, and medieval buildings were not soundproof. Stone echoed. Wood carried vibration. A dropped object could be heard across a courtyard. Assassins adapted by accepting that witnesses were likely. Instead of avoiding them entirely, they planned to confuse them, to act quickly, to blend back into motion before anyone could react fully. This was risky. Witnesses did not need to see everything. They only needed to see enough: a shape, a direction, a face half lit by torchlight. Memory filled in the rest later. And memory mattered. Medieval justice relied heavily on testimony. If several people remembered the same thing, even imperfectly, it became truth. Contradictions were resolved through force, not investigation. Assassins understood this, which made public killings terrifying. Every additional person present increased the chance of recognition later. Even if no one intervened, someone would talk. People talked constantly. After a killing, rumors spread faster than facts. Descriptions changed. Details sharpened. Someone always claimed to have noticed something earlier. Someone else remembered a suspicious stranger. The story grew. Assassins did not need to be identified accurately. They only needed to be plausible. The lack of privacy also meant assassins had to act under pressure. There was no waiting for the perfect moment. Moments passed quickly. Miss one, and the opportunity might not return. So many killings happened in motion. On streets, at thresholds, during transitions. A target entering or leaving a space was vulnerable. These moments were brief and unpredictable. This increased the chance of mistakes. The humor here is grim and quiet. Imagine planning the most dangerous act of your life in an environment where a goat might wander through at any moment, or a child, or a neighbor leaning out a window to argue about laundry. Medieval life was not staged for secrecy. Even night offered little relief. Darkness did not bring silence. It brought other people doing other things quietly. Watchmen patrolled. Tavern patrons stumbled home. Animals moved freely. Torches flickered and revealed movement in uneven light. Shadows were unreliable. Assassins also had to contend with social expectation. Sudden violence was shocking, but not unheard of. People were accustomed to fights. What drew attention was unusual behavior. Someone lingering, someone watching too closely, someone leaving too quickly. Trying to act invisible often made an assassin more noticeable, and when violence did happen, crowds reacted unpredictably. Sometimes they froze, sometimes they chased, sometimes they joined in. Mob behavior was not something an assassin could control. In some cases, assassins were caught immediately by bystanders. In others, they escaped initially but were identified later through discussion and rumor. Either outcome was bad. There was also the problem of unintended witnesses. Someone behind a door, someone upstairs, someone looking out at the wrong moment. Medieval people spent a lot of time watching their surroundings. Entertainment options were limited. Assassins learned to accept that complete secrecy was impossible. Instead, they aimed for speed. Speed reduced exposure. Speed reduced questions. Speed reduced the time witnesses had to process what they saw. But speed increased errors. A rushed strike missed vital areas. A rushed poisoning was noticed. A rushed escape took the wrong street. Public space did not forgive mistakes. Even successful public assassinations carried long-term risk. People replayed events in their minds. They compared notes. Over time, details converged. A man with a limp, a scar, a familiar cloak. This is why so many assassins were caught days later, not minutes later. The city itself remembered them. Cities were small enough for memory to circulate. Faces became known. Suspicion hardened. Public killing also made authorities respond faster and more aggressively. Murder threatened order. Order was fragile. Displays of violence forced officials to act, even if reluctantly. This meant increased patrols, questioning, and pressure. Innocent people were swept up. Guilty ones were found through endurance, not evidence. For assassins, public space turned every job into a countdown. Not just to escape, but to remain unknown long enough to leave the area entirely. Leaving a city was not simple. Gates closed. Travel required explanation. Suspicion followed travelers, which leads to the next problem. Even if an assassin survived the act itself, even if they were not immediately seized by a crowd, there was still the matter of getting away, and escape, in the Middle Ages, was rarely clean. In the next chapter, we will follow the assassin after the killing, tired, injured, watched, and trying to disappear through a world that did not want to forget them. Escape is where the stories usually end. A shadow slips away, footsteps fade. The assassin is gone before anyone understands what happened. The city exhales. The night swallows the crime. Medieval life did not work like that. Getting away was often harder than the killing itself. Cities in the Middle Ages were controlled spaces. Walls surrounded them. Gates regulated entry and exit. These gates did not stay open all night. They closed at dusk, sometimes earlier in troubled times. Leaving a city required timing, explanation, and luck. Assassins rarely had all three. If a killing happened late in the day, escape often meant hiding inside the city until morning. This was dangerous. People talked overnight. Watchmen became alert. Doors closed. Inns asked questions. A stranger with no clear reason to stay stood out quickly. City watchers were not professional police forces, but they were persistent. Watchmen knew their streets. They recognized regulars. They noticed people moving with purpose at odd hours. A man walking too fast, too slow, or with the wrong posture invited attention. And assassins were rarely calm after a killing. They were tired. Their heart was racing. Their body was flooded with adrenaline. Hands shook. Breathing changed. Injuries hurt more once the moment passed. Blood-stained clothing in places that were hard to explain. This made blending in difficult. Escape routes were often imagined in advance, but rarely tested. An alley that looked clear in daylight might be blocked at night. A door once left open might now be barred. A friendly house might suddenly be occupied by guests. Plans unraveled quickly. Assassins also had to contend with curfews. Being outside late required a reason. Carrying a weapon required an explanation. Running required a very good one. Any inconsistency drew suspicion. Even if an assassin reached a gate, leaving was not guaranteed. Guards asked questions. Where were you going? Why now? Who do you know there? Lies had to be simple and confident. Fear complicated that. Some assassins tried to leave disguised as merchants or pilgrims. This helped only if the disguise was convincing. Merchants carried goods. Pilgrims carried tokens. Guards noticed details. A man without the right calluses, tools, or accents raised doubts. And if the gates were closed, escape was impossible until morning. So assassins hid. They hid in cellars, sheds, abandoned buildings, or sympathetic homes. Each hiding place came with risk. Someone might recognize them. Someone might betray them. Someone might decide the reward for turning them in was worth the trouble. Because rewards existed, authorities often offered incentives for information. Food, coin, favor. In hard times, this mattered. A man hiding was a liability to anyone sheltering him. Assassins also carried something else that made escape hard. Rumor. Even before official descriptions circulated, people talked. A man had been seen running. Someone heard footsteps. Someone saw a cloak like yours earlier. These fragments moved through neighborhoods quickly. The assassin did not need to be identified clearly. Suspicion alone was dangerous. Leaving the city after a day or two was sometimes worse than leaving immediately. By then, stories had formed. Guards were alert. Faces were compared. A traveler departing suddenly looked guilty. Travel itself was slow. Roads were poor. Inns were spaced apart. Horses were expensive. Walking took time. Every mile increased exposure. And outside the city, danger did not vanish. Rural communities were even more suspicious of strangers. A lone traveler arriving from a city known for trouble attracted attention. People asked where you came from. News traveled faster than you might expect. Assassins often carried injuries that slowed them down. A limp, a wrapped hand, a bandaged arm. These made them memorable. Injuries also required care. Care required stopping. Stopping created risk. The humor here is bleak. Imagine surviving the most dangerous moment of your life, only to be undone by exhaustion, bad roads, and a suspicious innkeeper with too much time. Many assassins were caught not during the act, but afterward. Days later, weeks later, someone recognized them. Someone connected a story. Someone remembered a face. Escape was rarely dramatic. It was slow and uncomfortable. It involved hunger, fear, and constant second-guessing. Every sound felt like pursuit. Every question felt loaded. And the body remembered what the mind tried to forget. Sleep was poor. Dreams were worse. Fatigue made mistakes more likely. Some assassins turned themselves in without realizing it. They drank too much. They talked. They sought comfort in familiar places. Familiar places were the worst choice. Others tried to disappear entirely. They changed names. They moved far away. This worked sometimes. More often, it failed. Medieval records were inconsistent, but memory was not. People remembered faces, accents, habits, and there was always the chance that the client wanted the assassin gone. We should not forget that escape did not always mean escape from justice. Sometimes it meant escape into a worse situation. A client who decided the assassin knew too much. A rival who saw an opportunity. an intermediary tying up loose ends. An assassin on the run was vulnerable. The longer the escape took, the more opportunities there were for betrayal. Fear made people careless. Carelessness exposed them. When assassins were caught after fleeing, punishment was harsher. Flight implied guilt. Guilt demanded spectacle. Authorities needed to show control. Escaped killers embarrassed them, so they responded aggressively. This is why escape, even when successful, often felt temporary. Many assassins lived with the sense that they were only delaying something inevitable. They slept lightly. They avoided crowds. They never fully relaxed. And many were eventually caught, not because they were foolish, but because medieval systems were designed to close in slowly, through repetition, through rumor, through pressure. Escape was not a clean break. It was a drawn-out process that eroded the assassin physically and mentally. Surviving the night did not mean surviving the consequences, which brings us to what happened when escape failed. Because in the Middle Ages, capture did not mean a trial as we imagine it. It meant something far more direct. In the next chapter, we will talk about what waited for assassins once they were taken into custody, and why, for many, death was not the part they feared most. Capture was not the end of the story. For medieval assassins, it was usually the beginning of the worst part. When an assassin was taken into custody, there was no careful investigation, no long debate about evidence, no concern for mental state or intent. Medieval justice was not designed to discover truth. It was designed to restore order and discourage repetition. And the fastest way to do that was pain. Authorities believed that truth lived somewhere inside the body and that pain could force it out. This belief was widely accepted. Confession mattered more than accuracy. A confession ended uncertainty. It gave officials something solid to present to the public. Assassins were prime candidates for this treatment. They were already considered morally corrupt, violent, dangerous. Few people argued for their protection. Torture was not seen as cruelty, it was seen as procedure. Interrogation began quickly. The goal was not just to confirm guilt, it was to extract names, employers, intermediaries, anyone else who might be involved. The assassin's body became a tool for mapping hidden networks. The methods varied by region, but the logic was the same. Apply pressure, increase it gradually. Stop only when answers came or when the body could no longer respond. We do not need to describe these methods in detail to understand their effect. Pain broke resistance. It blurred memory. It encouraged invention. Under enough pressure, people said what interrogators wanted to hear. True confessions and false ones blended together. Assassins knew this before they were captured. They feared it deeply, not just because of the pain, but because of what it would force them to do. Naming names could doom others. Staying silent could extend suffering. There was no good choice. Many confessed quickly to end it. Others held out longer, hoping for mercy that rarely came. Silence was interpreted as defiance. Defiance invited escalation. The humor here is bitter and faint. Medieval authorities believed torture revealed truth, while modern observers know it mostly reveals endurance limits. The system was very good at producing answers. It was less good at producing correct ones. Employers understood this risk, which is why many arranged to distance themselves early. They bribed officials. They destroyed evidence. They prepared alibis. When an assassin confessed, powerful names were often ignored or quietly removed from the record. The assassin, however, remained. Torture was also public knowledge. People expected it. Crowds assumed it happened. It reinforced the idea that justice was being done. Even if details were hidden, the outcome was understood. For the assassin, time stretched strangely. Pain collapsed moments together. Memory fractured. People promised anything to make it stop. Confessions became survival strategies, not moral statements. Some assassins tried to lie carefully. They named dead people. They blamed rivals. They invented employers. This sometimes worked briefly. It also sometimes made things worse when inconsistencies were noticed. Authorities did not require consistency. They required submission. Once a confession was obtained, the process moved quickly. There was little reason to keep the assassin alive longer than necessary. They had served their purpose. The confession justified the punishment. The punishment justified the authority. It is important to understand that medieval torture was not hidden in shame. It was integrated into the justice system. It reinforced social boundaries. It reminded people what happened when lines were crossed. Assassins were ideal examples. They had committed violence outside accepted structures. They threatened the idea that power was controlled. Punishing them publicly restored balance, at least symbolically. Many assassins entered captivity, already injured from escape. Torture compounded these injuries. Survival was not guaranteed. Some died before execution. Their bodies were still displayed. The message mattered more than the individual. Religion sometimes played a role. Confession could be framed as a chance for spiritual cleansing. Some priests encouraged it. Others refused involvement. Absolution was uncertain. Forgiveness was not guaranteed. This added another layer of fear. Assassins worried not only about their bodies, but about their souls. Dying without confession meant eternal consequences, according to belief at the time. Torture became entangled with salvation. Some assassins begged to confess immediately. Others resisted until the end, clinging to silence as the last thing they controlled. Both paths led to the same destination. The system did not reward courage, it rewarded compliance. From the perspective of authorities, torture worked. It produced closure. It produced spectacle. It produced fear. Whether it produced truth was secondary. For the assassin, torture erased any remaining illusion of professionalism or honor. There were no last words spoken calmly, no dignified acceptance. There was only endurance until the body failed, or the will did. This is why many medieval assassins feared capture more than death. Death was brief. Torture stretched time. It invaded identity. It turned survival instincts against themselves. And yet, even torture was not the final act. Because in the Middle Ages, punishment did not end with confession or even with death. The body still had work to do. In the next chapter, we will see how execution itself became only one part of a larger performance, one meant to warn, humiliate, and erase. Because for medieval assassins, dying was not enough. They had to be remembered the right way. Execution is often imagined as the end. A rope tightens, a blade falls, a body goes still. The story fades to black, neat and final. For medieval assassins, this moment was rarely treated as closure. It was treated as a transition. Death was not enough. In the Middle Ages, punishment was not designed to remove a person quietly. It was designed to speak, to linger, to teach. The execution of an assassin was a message written on the body, and that message did not stop once the heart did. Authorities understood something very clearly. Fear worked best when it stayed visible, so executions were public. Always. They happened in squares, near gates, or along busy roads, places where people had to pass, places where forgetting was difficult. Crowds gathered, some out of curiosity, some out of obligation, some because avoiding such events could itself raise suspicion. Children came to this was education. For assassins, the method of execution mattered. It reflected the perceived threat. Hanging was common. It was simple, familiar, and effective. But assassins were often given harsher deaths. Drawing and quartering, beheading followed by display. Sometimes combinations meant to extend the moment. These methods were not chosen randomly. They were symbolic. The more secretive the crime, the more visible the punishment. An assassin who worked in shadows was dragged into the light. The body became a warning sign. Executioners were professionals, but precision varied. A poorly tied knot, a dull blade, a misjudged strike. Pain and chaos were not unusual. The crowd reacted with noise, discomfort, or grim satisfaction. There was no dignity guaranteed. If the execution went badly, it was not considered a failure. It was considered effective. Once death occurred, the process continued. Bodies were not always buried. In fact, burial was often denied. Instead, remains were displayed. Heads placed on spikes, limbs nailed to gates, bodies hung in cages and left to decay. These displays lasted days, sometimes weeks. Weather did the rest. This was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was pedagogy. The sight and smell reinforced memory. People talked about it. They warned each other. Parents pointed and explained. This is what happens. For assassins, this meant their final contribution to society was as an object lesson. There is a quiet irony here. Assassins spent their working lives trying not to be seen. Their deaths ensured they would be seen by everyone, and not as individuals, as symbols. Their names were often announced, their crimes simplified, their motives reduced. Complexity was unnecessary. What mattered was clarity. A bad man did a bad thing and suffered greatly for it. This protected the system. Sometimes, parts of the body were sent elsewhere, a head shipped to another town, a limb displayed near the site of the crime. The punishment traveled. The warning expanded. For families, this was devastating. Relatives were often forced to witness or were prevented from intervening. They could not claim the body. They could not mourn properly. Burial rites were denied or delayed. In a religious society, this mattered deeply. The dead assassin was cut off not only from the living, but from spiritual closure. Execution also erased legal identity. Property could be seized, debts transferred, homes confiscated. The punishment spread outward, touching anyone connected. We will talk more about families later. For now, it is enough to say that execution marked the beginning of social erasure. Records described assassins briefly and coldly. Executed for murder, put to death for treason. Details faded. What remained was the warning. The humor here, if it exists, is deeply uncomfortable. Medieval authorities believed these displays prevented future crime. History suggests they mostly ensured people learned how power worked. The assassin's body was no longer theirs. It belonged to the city. Even burial, when allowed, was often restricted. Graves placed outside consecrated ground, unmarked, forgotten by design. No stone, no name. The absence itself was part of the punishment. For those who feared damnation, this was terrifying. Denial of burial rites suggested exclusion from salvation. Whether this belief was accurate mattered less than the fear it inspired. Some assassins begged for burial more than for mercy. They rarely received it. Executions were also political theater. They reassured the public that order still existed, that violence could be controlled, that rulers were watching. This mattered especially when assassins were tied, even loosely, to powerful figures. By punishing the assassin harshly, authorities deflected attention from larger questions. Who ordered this? Why? Those questions were inconvenient. It was easier to end the story with a body on display. In some cases, execution was delayed to maximize impact. Prisoners were paraded, confessions read aloud. The crowd was prepared, anticipation built. The assassin by then was often barely recognizable. Injury, torture, hunger, and fear had stripped them down. They were not legends. They were exhausted humans, and then they became objects. Once the body was displayed, it continued to shape behavior. Travelers avoided certain roads. Children grew up with landmarks marked by decay. Turn left at the hanging cage. Geography absorbed punishment. Eventually, the body was removed. Bones scattered. Wood rotted. Iron rusted. But the memory lingered. This was the point. Execution was not about justice in a modern sense. It was about reassurance. It told people that the world still had edges, that crossing certain lines led to visible ends. For assassins, this meant their lives ended, not with reflection or understanding, but with reduction. They became examples stripped of context. No one asked why they did it. No one explained their hunger, debt, or fear. Those details complicated the message, and messages prefer simplicity. It is also worth noting that not all executions were cleanly accepted. Crowds sometimes sympathized, sometimes murmured, sometimes turned away. Authorities noticed this and adjusted displays accordingly. Fear had to be maintained. In rare cases, bodies were removed early due to unrest or decay causing illness. Even then, the warning had already done its work. Execution ended the assassin's movement. It did not end the consequences. Their name, if remembered at all, was tied forever to disgrace. Their family carried that weight. Their children inherited suspicion. Their memory became a barrier. And so, for medieval assassins, death was not release. It was deployment. The body was used one last time, which brings us to the next chapter, because the punishment did not stop with the person who committed the act. It moved outward, quietly and efficiently, into homes and lives that had already suffered enough. In the next chapter, we will look at those left behind, and how, for them, the execution was only the beginning too. When a medieval assassin was caught, tortured, and executed, the story rarely ended there. In fact, for their family, it had barely begun. Because in the Middle Ages, the sins of the individual were often considered a reflection on the household, and the household, in turn, bore the consequences. Families lived close together, not just physically, but socially. Wives, children, and even distant relatives were tied to the assassin's reputation. In many towns, a person's social network was their safety net, and when one member fell into disgrace, that network frayed quickly. Imagine a widow who had no hand in her husband's work. She suddenly found herself living in a neighborhood that whispered. Her neighbors were suspicious. Tradesmen hesitated to sell her goods. Local authorities eyed her more closely. People assumed she knew things, supported crimes, or was hiding secrets. And even if she had nothing to do with the murder, society treated her as complicit. Children were particularly vulnerable. Trades and apprenticeships were often closed to families tainted by scandal. A blacksmith's son might find no workshop willing to take him. A daughter might be barred from service in a wealthy household. Even if they were innocent, the shadow of the assassin followed them. The state sometimes intervened formally. Property could be confiscated, houses seized, savings taken. Any assets of value were absorbed into the system as fines or rewards. In some cases, debts that the assassin had incurred became the family's responsibility. Families were caught in a trap, tied to the assassin's misdeeds, yet powerless to defend themselves. This punishment was not always legally codified, but socially, it was relentless. Gossip, exclusion, and shame became as effective as the hangman's rope. Communities remembered, people whispered, names became warnings. The family lived in the aftermath of someone else's choices. Even surviving relatives were not always safe from physical consequences. In some regions, authorities extended violence to the household as a deterrent. The threat was clear: commit or enable a crime, and it will not just be you who suffers. Assassins often knew this going in. It was part of the calculus of their profession. Some tried to make arrangements in advance, leaving instructions for hidden valuables or safe houses for their families. But luck was inconsistent. One failed job, one suspicious neighbor, one unexpected rumor could undo careful planning. Sometimes families were abandoned before the assassin ever returned home. A man sent out on a job might not survive, or might be captured and executed. Wives and children suddenly faced survival alone. Social support had eroded. Poverty loomed. Hunger followed. Many widows could not secure work or protection. Children went hungry or were sent to relatives, assuming relatives would take them in. Sometimes they did not. The psychological impact was enormous. Loss, combined with fear and stigma, created a constant pressure. The surviving family members had to navigate suspicion, poverty, and the looming threat of further punishment. Every interaction with neighbors, tradespeople, or local officials was fraught. Every stranger could be a threat or an informer. The pressure extended even further. Families often had to make choices no one should make. A widow might be forced into labor she would otherwise avoid. Children might be apprenticed in conditions harsher than normal. Relatives had to hide their identities or relocate entirely to escape the long shadow of a parent's actions. Social exile became a quiet, persistent punishment. In many cases, families tried to avoid association entirely. They changed names, moved towns, severed connections. But medieval societies were small. News traveled slowly, but it traveled. Patterns were recognized. Someone eventually remembered, and when suspicion found a family, it could be reinforced by rumor, local law, or the judgment of neighbors. Marriage prospects for children suffered. Social mobility was curtailed. Even if an assassin's family worked hard to restore honor, the stigma persisted. Society had long memories. The lessons learned from public punishment were meant to echo for years. The family was an extension of the crime, a living reminder that the consequences were real and tangible. And here is the quiet cruelty. While the assassin faced immediate punishment, the family faced ongoing punishment. Pain, stress, hunger, and social exile did not end with death. They continued, sometimes for decades. Entire generations carried the weight of one individual's desperate choices. The irony is that families often suffered more than the assassin did in practical terms. The assassin's life ended, perhaps quickly, with a brutal certainty. Families endured slowly, painfully, and without closure. Death was finite. Social erasure was endless. Even those families who were remotely able to retain property found that social life became difficult. Trades, alliances, and friendships required trust, and trust was gone. Communities were wary. One unlucky coincidenza, missing coin, a broken promise, a whispered accusation could revive the stigma. And because life in medieval towns was tightly woven, the consequences radiated outward. Extended relatives, neighbors, and even servants might face scrutiny. Families became collateral in a system designed not only to punish the individual, but to reinforce order. Sometimes, families tried to petition authorities. Appeals rarely succeeded. Law was local and hierarchical. A widow or child with no money or influence had few options. Mercy was selective. Justice was performative. The system cared about perception more than truth. Religion offered little solace. Burial rites could be denied. Confession was complicated if one's sins were inherited in the eyes of the community. Spiritual and social punishment intertwined, compounding isolation. Even prayers did not erase suspicion. Faith offered comfort in theory, but in practice, society's judgment weighed heavier. The humor here is dry, bitter, and subtle. Assassins sought danger for money or survival, but the real long-term victims were often the people they left behind. The legend of the brave assassin ignores the quiet suffering of widows, children, and neighbors. Real consequences do not make for entertaining tales, so they are rarely told. But they were lived, and they lasted. In some cases, the family's suffering became a story itself. Rumors exaggerated. Innocents bore blame. Social lessons were reinforced. Public memory treated families as cautionary examples. Children learned early that the sins of one could poison the lives of many. For assassins, this was another calculation. Some accepted the risk knowingly. Hunger, debt, and desperation outweighed concern for their families. Others underestimated the social consequences, focusing only on the immediate danger. Either way, outcomes were rarely favorable. Historical records rarely preserved the voices of these families. Most remained nameless, remembered only as extensions of someone else's crime. They were erased from chronicles, property lists, and legal proceedings. Only shadows of their existence remain. Only faint whispers suggest the scale of their suffering. The cumulative effect of family punishment also reinforced social order. Communities understood that crime was dangerous, not just for the criminal, but for everyone connected. Fear extended outward, creating a buffer that discouraged rebellion, desperation, or bold acts of violence. For the assassin, this added another layer of moral and practical complexity. Every action carried consequences beyond the immediate risk to life. Every job meant that loved ones could suffer far more than the assassin themselves. Survival was a narrow victory. The collateral damage was vast. And yet, despite this knowledge, so many still became assassins. Poverty, desperation, coercion, and lack of choice pushed them into these roles. The family risk was secondary in the moment. Hunger demanded attention before morality, and fear was focused on immediate survival rather than distant consequences. It is easy from a modern perspective to judge, but understanding the lived reality is harder. One must imagine desperation, isolation, and limited options shaping choices. Even a morally conflicted assassin could see no alternative that guaranteed safety or sustenance. The tragedy of medieval assassination is thus not just in the lives of those who performed it, but in the silent suffering of those around them. Families were punished socially, economically, and spiritually. Their homes became sites of shame. Their lives became constrained by decisions over which they had no control. In the end, the assassin's death was visible, brief, and dramatic. The family's suffering was invisible, slow, and enduring. One ended in spectacle. The other lingered quietly, shaping memory and social life for years. This is why medieval assassination was more than a personal risk. It was a social one. It connected violence, justice, and community consequences in ways modern observers rarely consider. And this ripple effect continued beyond immediate families. Neighbors, apprentices, and extended kin felt the weight too. A single act of desperation reshaped entire networks of people. Medieval society was small, and repercussions traveled fast. Every choice carried more weight than any assassin could safely calculate. Which is why, when we think about assassins, it is important to remember those left behind. They often bore the heaviest burden. The assassin might die with some measure of clarity or terror, but the family endured the consequences for years, unseen, unremarked, and largely forgotten. In the next chapter, we will explore another invisible weight, the spiritual fear that haunted assassins long before the executioner arrived, and sometimes long after, because death was not the only thing they feared. For medieval assassins, fear did not stop with the city walls, with guards, or even with execution. A far heavier shadow often followed them. Religious fear. In a world shaped by the church, death was not the final score. The soul mattered as much as the body, and assassins carried the weight of spiritual consequence with them, often more heavily than the threat of arrest or torture. Murder was considered mortal sin. There was no debate, no circumstance that erased it completely. Even if an assassin was coerced, desperate, or acting in self-preservation, the act of taking another life placed a permanent mark on the soul, according to medieval belief. And that mark was terrifying. Imagine living your life with that knowledge. Every step, Every decision, every meal weighed down by the possibility of eternal damnation. Every quiet moment carried the question, what if God is watching now? This fear was compounded by uncertainty about confession. The church controlled the narrative of salvation. Absolution was not automatic. Clergy could refuse absolution to someone they deemed unworthy, and assassins, often living on the margins of society, did not have easy access to sympathetic priests. Many clergy were wary of touching the spiritually unclean. Some assassins sought last-minute confessions. They carried rosaries or small tokens for penance. They memorized prayers. They tried to find priests willing to listen before their time came, but the church's help was conditional. Repentance had to be genuine, public, and aligned with its rules. Too little effort or too much suspicion meant the soul was still in jeopardy. Religious fear influenced behavior long before capture. Assassins prayed quietly, avoided certain churches, and sometimes avoided holy days entirely. They might linger outside the community for fear that a blessing or ritual would expose them. Every act carried spiritual risk. Every interaction might be weighed in judgment, even if no human observer noticed. This fear was practical too. Public knowledge of sin often accompanied punishment. Confession might become an admission in front of a crowd. Clergy who refused absolution increased social exposure. An assassin could survive a job physically unscathed, but spiritually and socially crippled by the judgment of others. For some, fear of damnation was worse than the threat of torture. Death by execution was immediate. Pain was limited in time, but eternal punishment stretched endlessly, imagined to last forever. The mind could replay choices, envision every step as a moral failure, and imagine hell as real, vivid, and eternal. Humor, of a dark sort, emerges in imagining medieval assassins counting scenes instead of bodies. A man might plan a job carefully, map escape routes, and calculate payment, but forget to consider that failing to say the right prayer might mean eternal torment. Irony was subtle, but cruel. This religious weight shaped decisions. Some assassins delayed acts to coincide with holy days, hoping for extra mercy. Others avoided acts near churches to minimize sin in sacred spaces. Many prayed after each killing, performing small rituals in secret. Some carried crosses in pouches, hoping physical symbols would counteract spiritual guilt. Even poisoners were not exempt. A man who tricked a victim into death through a cunning dose might see the act as clever in worldly terms, but in spiritual terms. It was deception and premeditation combined. Premeditation was damning. Intent mattered more than result. Accidentally killing someone was bad. Planning to kill was far worse. Many assassins experienced recurring anxiety. Sleep was troubled. Dreams were filled with judgment, fire, or divine witnesses. Even those who seemed calm externally might wake in the night drenched in sweat, praying for absolution that might not come. For some, religion offered a thin hope. Sacraments could provide temporary comfort. A mass, a confession, or a private prayer might ease anxiety. But the underlying fear remained. Were these acts enough? Had they sinned too deeply? Could salvation be purchased, earned, or begged for in time? And the irony was cruel. Acts meant to protect life money survival. Loyalty often conflicted with spiritual law. An assassin might save their own life by killing another, but the soul paid a cost that could never be repaid fully. Survival came at the price of eternal anxiety. This fear shaped social behavior as well. Assassins often avoided clergy they did not trust, and avoided other religious figures entirely. They were careful about who saw them enter churches, lest suspicion attached to them. The network of spiritual oversight became a layer of pressure atop social and legal dangers. The consequences extended even to planning the escape. If an assassin fled through a town, they might avoid blessed grounds, cross themselves, or utter quiet prayers to avoid observation. Every step was moral and practical, simultaneously. Survival and salvation were tangled together, each complicating the other. Even execution could not resolve the anxiety. The body might be displayed. The soul remained in question. Families feared for their own spiritual standing. Clergy might intervene to allow burial or ceremony, but only after careful negotiation. Absence of ritual could be interpreted as spiritual condemnation, which intensified guilt and fear for surviving family members. This spiritual weight often lingered in stories and memory. Chroniclers noted fear, confession, and last-minute penitence. Some assassins reportedly begged priests for last rites multiple times before execution. Others reportedly died in terror, not only of earthly punishment but of imagined eternal consequences. Religious fear also influenced choice of targets. Some assassins avoided killing clergy, monks, or anyone deeply connected to the church. The risk of spiritual backlash was seen as high, and vengeance from both mortal and divine sources was feared. These limits shaped the work, sometimes forcing desperate improvisation or risky maneuvers. Even for those who survived longer, fear never disappeared. Memory carried the weight of sin. Every action had potential moral consequence. And because medieval communities were religious, social suspicion and spiritual anxiety were intertwined. One could not escape one without encountering the other. Finally, religious fear was deeply personal. No assassin could rely on someone else's interpretation of salvation. The judgment of God was absolute, personal, and unknowable. This created a mental landscape of tension, where survival, secrecy, and spiritual well-being were constantly in conflict. In short, for medieval assassins, fear never ended. Death might come quickly, torture was excruciating, execution could be public, brutal, and humiliating, but spiritual fear lingered in ways that were invisible, relentless, and intimate, and it did not spare the mind before death. It did not spare the hours after. It accompanied the assassin from the first decision to take a life until the last heartbeat, and often beyond. This is one reason medieval assassins are difficult to romanticize. Popular culture imagines shadows, blades, and clever escapes. But in life, their fear was constant, layered, and all-consuming of law, of society, of family, and of God. In the next chapter, we will explore another harsh truth. No matter how skilled or careful, assassins were disposable to the very powers that employed them. Survival depended not only on skill, but on being expendable, and that often meant betrayal was inevitable. Because for those who worked in darkness, daylight and power rarely offered protection. In the medieval world, power was fragile. Lords, kings, and wealthy patrons ruled by influence, fear, and reputation. They needed violence, but not the people who carried it out. For assassins, this reality shaped every decision, every relationship, and often every breath. The first rule of being employed by the powerful was simple. You were replaceable. No contract guaranteed your safety. No alliance could protect you. If your employer wanted you gone because you knew too much, failed a task, or simply became inconvenient, there was little to prevent it. Your usefulness determined your value, and once that usefulness ended, your life could end too. Imagine it. You are given a task that requires secrecy, precision, and courage. You succeed. The job is done. You expect payment, or at least acknowledgement. But your employer has already calculated a way to erase the evidence that you existed. After all, the fewer people who know too much, the safer the ruler. Many assassins disappeared under suspicious circumstances. A failed arrest elsewhere, a sudden execution on flimsy charges, or a reward gone wrong were all common. Death could arrive as easily from a patron's whim as from justice. The concept of loyalty existed mostly on the side of the employer. The assassin had no such privilege. This created a life lived in constant calculation. Every interaction was measured. Who could be trusted? Who might report you? Who might see your departure and tie it back to a crime or a patron? Even the most careful assassin could be betrayed by someone seeking favor, money, or revenge. The irony is harsh. Rulers who hired assassins often celebrated discretion, yet they expected absolute loyalty. They wanted results without responsibility. Assassins were instruments, not partners. Once the instrument was used, it could be discarded without concern. Sometimes, this betrayal was direct. Employers arranged deaths to cover tracks. A poisoned cup, a staged accident, or a sudden arrest could remove the assassin as effectively as a blade. Often, there was no trial, no public acknowledgement, just disappearance. The message was clear: the powerful are untouchable, and those who serve them are expendable. Even when employers were technically benevolent, trust was fragile. Money could be withheld. Promises of protection were often meaningless. An assassin might complete a job, collect payment, and then find themselves abandoned when retaliation or suspicion arose. Survival depended as much on luck as skill. Assassins often learned this lesson painfully. Alliances were fleeting. Protection could evaporate overnight. Informants and intermediaries were double-edged. Someone who helped you yesterday could be used to condemn you tomorrow. Networks were shallow, and loyalty was rare. This reality shaped behavior. Assassins often avoided establishing strong personal ties. They minimized emotional connections. Every friendship, Every alliance carried the risk of betrayal or exposure. Social bonds, which might have provided comfort, instead became liabilities. And yet, many assassins remained employed. Hunger, debt, coercion, and fear outweighed the risk of betrayal. Survival required doing work that could, at any moment, be turned against them. They lived with one eye on the target and the other on their patron, calculating risk constantly. Power also demanded plausible deniability. Employers rarely admitted they had contracted an assassin. They preferred shadows and intermediaries. If an assassin was caught or exposed, the patron could claim ignorance. The assassin alone bore the consequences. This was not conspiracy in the modern sense. It was efficient administration. The political logic was simple. Violence was necessary, but evidence of that violence could weaken authority. Killing the killer, or allowing the assassin to fail, erased witnesses. It ensured that the chain of command remained untouchable. Power depended on silence, and silence often required the ultimate price, the life of the assassin. This made employment doubly dangerous. Not only did the job involve killing another person, but it also involved placing oneself entirely in the hands of someone willing to discard you. Every assignment was both a test and a potential death sentence. Irony often surfaced in subtle ways. Some assassins who survived decades, became skilled, and navigated treacherous networks, still lived with constant fear of abandonment. Their greatest successes did not guarantee safety. The more competent they were, the more dangerous they became to those who employed them. Knowledge was power, and power was a threat to other power. Disposal was not always immediate. Some assassins were abandoned slowly, left to fend for themselves without support. Others were framed, blamed for failures they did not commit, or publicly executed to reinforce the idea that betrayal could be lethal. The system was self-reinforcing. Assassins served, and then were erased. Even cultural myths hint at this. Tales often celebrate the cleverness of assassins, their precision, their daring escapes. Rarely do they mention how often these figures were used and discarded. The romantic narrative masks the reality. Invisibility in life did not protect against erasure in death. This disposability extended to planning and execution. Assassins could not assume loyalty from anyone, including those they trusted. Every intermediary, messenger, or ally could be a liability. Mistakes were costly, not only for themselves, but for anyone connected. The assassin's world was a constant balance between action and self-preservation. Where the scales were rarely in their favor, the emotional toll was immense. Knowing that one could be discarded at any moment created a persistent state of anxiety. Trust was dangerous. Rest was a luxury. Survival required constant vigilance, mental calculation, and acceptance of mortality. Some assassins attempted to create small measures of security. Hidden funds, secret escape routes, disguises and identities prepared in advance. Yet all of these measures were temporary. The risk of exposure never fully disappeared. One misstep, one chance encounter, one rumor could undo everything. The subtle humor, if one can call it that, is that these figures were sometimes celebrated in lore as elite, untouchable, or heroic. In truth, the most skilled were often the most disposable. Their successes made them useful, but also marked them as threats to be eliminated when convenient. Even fame was dangerous. Stories of clever assassins spread slowly. Patrons sometimes encouraged it for intimidation. But with visibility came vulnerability. Recognition could lead to arrest, betrayal, or death at the hands of rivals or even those who once employed them. This is why so many medieval assassins had short careers. Some survived a few years, others a decade or two. Very few retired. Even those who lived longer often disappeared quietly, removed from history by the systems that once employed them. The lesson, clear and cold, was that power tolerated no dependence on those it used. Assassins were tools. Tools were effective only while functional. Once worn out, they were discarded. Loyalty mattered little. Skill mattered only insofar as it served someone else's goals. In some cases, patrons framed their use of assassins as pragmatic. They claimed necessity, plausibility, and public interest. But beneath this veneer, the pattern was simple. Take advantage of those willing to risk everything, and then remove them once they were no longer convenient. For the assassin, this created a worldview of constant caution. Trust was limited to essentials. Alliances were strategic. Relationships were transactional. Every decision involved not only the risk of death during a mission, but also the certainty that, once the mission was done, survival depended entirely on someone else's continuing interest. The cruelest irony was that this arrangement worked. It maintained power, it enforced obedience, it delivered results without accountability, and it ensured that those who carried out the work, the ones who moved in shadows and took lives, remained invisible, expendable, and, ultimately, silent. Assassins existed in a precarious equilibrium. Their survival required skill, intelligence, and nerve. Their ultimate fate depended on the whim of others. The more effective they were, the more disposable they became. This cycle repeated endlessly. One assassin replaced by another. One life sacrificed to protect authority. One death reinforcing the system that created it. In the end, the truth was simple and brutal. No assassin could ever fully escape being disposable. Success, skill, and loyalty offered only temporary reprieve. The only guarantee was that at some point, power would discard them, and it would do so without hesitation, mercy, or reflection. This disposability was the quiet terror that haunted every assassin, shaping their decisions long before capture, long before torture, and long before execution. Survival depended not just on talent, speed, or cunning, but on the fragile, unpredictable favor of those who held power. And when that favor ended, there was no recourse, no protection, and no legacy, except the lesson left behind for the next desperate soul willing to step into the shadows. When people think of medieval assassins, the first image that often comes to mind is the legendary Hashashin. Tales of this secretive sect conjure visions of shadowy killers, drugs, and absolute loyalty. The reality was more complex and far less cinematic. The Hashashin, also called the Nizari Ismailist, operated primarily in the mountains of Persia and Syria during the 11th to 13th centuries. They were a highly organized group with political and religious motivations. Unlike the European assassins we've discussed, who acted out of desperation, poverty, or coercion, the Hashashin followed ideology as much as survival. Their murders were calculated, symbolic, and designed to send clear political messages. This distinction is critical. European assassins rarely had guiding principles beyond survival. They were tools, motivated by hunger, fear, and opportunity. The Hashashin, by contrast, saw themselves as instruments of faith and discipline. Success mattered, yes, but so did the meaning behind the act. Even so, the romantic myths surrounding them are exaggerated. Popular imagination tends to flatten complexity. Stories of drug-induced obedience, miraculous escapes, or invulnerability create a cinematic image, but historians have found little evidence to support most of these claims. They were disciplined and effective, yes, but far from invincible. Members faced enormous personal costs. Operating in mountainous fortresses isolated them from family, friends, and ordinary society. Life was austere, training harsh, and failure lethal. Betrayal from within was punished swiftly. External enemies were relentless. Every mission involved strategic calculation, risk, and often self-sacrifice. Here is where the lesson connects to our European examples. Even the most disciplined, organized, and ideologically driven assassins paid a heavy price. Survival was never guaranteed. Escape was never clean. And failure, capture, or exposure almost always meant death. The Hashashin also illustrate a point about myth and memory. Their notoriety owes as much to exaggeration by enemies as to actual feats. Muslim chroniclers, crusader tales, and later European writings amplified their mystique. They became symbols of terror and cunning, sometimes at the cost of historical accuracy. This exaggeration has a parallel with European assassins. Popular culture often imagines them as highly skilled, elite, almost superhuman killers. Reality is different. Most were desperate, poorly armed, isolated, and constantly at risk. The exceptions, like the Hashashin, were organized, disciplined, and dangerous. But even they lived under relentless stress, fear, and mortality. Despite the fame, the Hashashin still faced the same fundamental problem. Life was temporary, and death was often unavoidable. Even in their mountain fortresses, surrounded by loyal followers and defensive structures, assassins could be betrayed or overwhelmed. Many died young. Others lived long enough to face physical decline, social irrelevance, or the slow erosion of their communities. What makes them remarkable is not invincibility, but the discipline and ideology that structured their lives. They are a rare instance where the assassin's identity was tied to purpose beyond survival. Every act had meaning. Every mission was framed by belief, and every death was understood as a continuation of that framework. Yet even this framework could not erase the human cost. Members experienced fear, isolation, injury, and uncertainty. Their families, when present, faced exile, danger, or social stigma. Their lives were constrained by rigid hierarchies and strict codes. Survival required obedience, skill, and calculation, and, even then, it was never guaranteed. The contrast with European assassins is instructive. A European operative might kill to pay a debt, flee for survival, and face betrayal by a client. A Hashashin killed to fulfill a mission, follow faith, and maintain discipline, but still risked death, injury, or failure. The external circumstances differed, but the personal costs remained brutally high. Irony, as always, is subtle. The Hashashin's mystique made them appear untouchable, elite, and clever. In reality, their lives were as fragile as anyone else's in the medieval world. Mountains offered defense, ideology offered purpose, but neither offered certainty. Fear, exhaustion, injury, and mortality persisted. Success could prolong life for a time. Failure could end it instantly. The Hashashin also highlight another important point. The stories we tell shape memory, but often obscure lived reality. European assassins, despite being far less organized, were no less vulnerable. They lived, worked, and died in fear. Their survival depended on skill, luck, and the whims of others. Their failures were catastrophic. Their successes rarely guaranteed safety. And even the Hashashin were human. Myths aside, they suffered physically, emotionally, and socially. Pain, hunger, fatigue, and fear shaped their daily lives. Their work was dangerous, their escape routes limited, and their survival dependent on factors often beyond their control. The myth obscures the truth. The exceptional assassin, whether European or Hashashin, still carried immense personal risk. They were exposed to physical harm, social isolation, betrayal, and death. Fame, ideology, or organization did not guarantee safety. The most disciplined could fall. The most clever could be betrayed. The most skilled could be discarded. For modern audiences, this is an important lesson. Romanticizing assassins, whether in history, books, or films, ignores the human cost. Life in the shadows was rarely glorious. It was often lonely, painful, and terrifying. Even the exceptions, like the Hashashin, lived with fear, discipline, and mortality hanging over them. In truth, the Hashashin were a rare exception in terms of organization and ideology. They were not invincible, superhuman, or immune to death. They were simply highly disciplined and strategically minded, and even they paid the ultimate price far too often. European assassins, by contrast, were almost always desperate, poorly equipped, and constantly exposed. Their work was rarely ideological. It was practical, brutal, and survival-driven. Both groups, however, shared one thing: constant vulnerability. Both faced betrayal, injury, exhaustion, and mortality. And both operated in worlds where mistakes were punished immediately, and often permanently. This makes the story of assassination in the Middle Ages less about heroism, cleverness, or romance, and more about survival, risk, and human desperation. The rare exceptions remind us that discipline and ideology could prolong life, but not eliminate danger. The ordinary assassin reminds us that most had no protection, no safety net, and no guarantee beyond the next breath. Ultimately, the lesson is simple. Assassins, whether the legendary Hashashin or a desperate European killer, lived on the edge. Their skills, planning, and cunning offered temporary reprieve, but fear, mortality, betrayal, and risk were constants. Life in shadows is fleeting. Death, for them, was often inevitable, and the human cost extended far beyond the individual, touching family, community, and sometimes even entire regions. Even myths serve as warnings. They tell us that skill and cunning do not equal safety, that ideology does not erase fear, and that living in darkness carries consequences far beyond the moment of action. Life as an assassin, however exceptional, was dangerous, fragile, and expensive in ways few outside the shadows could imagine. The Hashashin are remembered because they stand out, because their organization and discipline were remarkable. But history is filled with countless others whose lives were less structured, far less safe, and just as costly. They operated in darkness, but unlike the legends, they rarely left records. They were nameless, forgotten, and erased, just as easily as they were deployed and discarded. And yet, for a brief time, they existed, they acted, they survived, or failed, and their stories, partial, distorted and mythologized, offer one of the clearest glimpses into the realities of living as an assassin in the medieval world. Dangerous, lonely, and all too often disposable. For most assassins, survival was never guaranteed. But even those who managed to live past the first few years of their dangerous careers faced a quieter, slower threat: aging. Unlike warriors in armies, who could hope for pensions, land, or social status after service, assassins had no retirement plan, no guild to provide for them, no system to honor past service. In the medieval world, usefulness was everything, and usefulness, for an assassin, had a strict expiration date. As the body aged, speed slowed, reflexes dulled, eyesight weakened, injuries accumulated from years of harsh conditions, poor nutrition, and physical exertion. A dagger that once could pierce unnoticed now required more effort. A poisoned drink could no longer be measured as precisely. Crossbows or knives were unforgiving, and the body less reliable. This meant that aging assassins were often the first to fail. One slip in timing, one misjudged step, or one hesitation could expose them to capture. And when failure came, the consequences were immediate. The same social and legal systems that punished young assassins with torture, execution, and public display were still waiting. There was no leniency for age. In fact, vulnerability made them even more likely targets for betrayal or elimination. Many aging assassins were impoverished, without a family to support them, or with families who had been exiled, disowned, or dispossessed. They had few options. Their skills were too dangerous to employ in normal trades. They could not easily become guards, merchants, or laborers. Society had no place for a person who had spent decades living in shadows, deceiving, and killing. Injuries, too, compounded poverty. Cuts that never healed properly. Joint problems from climbing city walls or rooftops. Vision problems from poor lighting all made work more difficult. One bad fall could end a career. One chronic pain could prevent proper execution of a job, and without money or social support, recovery was minimal. Medicine was rudimentary, and most assassins could not afford care. Some tried to live quietly. They retired in villages, hiding from attention, attempting to blend into ordinary life. But invisibility was difficult. Rumors had a long life, and past deeds often caught up. Former clients could demand services. Enemies might seek revenge, and communities, small and tightly connected, often remembered faces long after the crimes had been committed. Aging also brought mental fatigue. Years of constant calculation, fear, and secrecy wore on the mind. Anxiety about betrayal, capture, or punishment did not lessen. Even if a person survived, the mental strain of planning, hiding, and executing dangerous acts accumulated. Sleep was often troubled, and nightmares of past deeds or potential exposure haunted them. Ironically, skill was not enough. Experience could prolong life, but it could not erase age. A clever plan might succeed, but the body's limits were a constant threat. A misjudged step in a narrow alley or a lapse in balance could undo decades of careful calculation. For the aging assassin, survival became a precarious balancing act between experience and declining ability. Some attempted to mitigate these challenges. They passed on knowledge to apprentices, hoping to gain favor, protection, or payment for their wisdom. But this strategy was risky. Sharing secrets could create rivals. Young students might betray their masters. Knowledge could be used to eliminate the teacher, ensuring the system remained efficient. The old removed to make way for the young. Others tried to live off savings, hiding in rural areas or begging for basic sustenance. But financial reserves rarely lasted. Years of dangerous work did not always yield stable income. Payments were inconsistent, often denied, and savings were vulnerable to theft or seizure. Poverty in old age was almost guaranteed. Social isolation deepened with age. Former colleagues might die or disappear. Allies were often younger, more mobile, and focused on survival themselves. Community ties were fragile for anyone who had spent years living outside societal norms. Isolation magnified vulnerability and mental strain. The religious aspect also persisted. Aging assassins who survived execution or capture still carried spiritual burdens. Guilt, fear of damnation, and anxiety over unresolved sins remained. Confession might be sought, but absolution was not always granted. Death approached not only as a physical certainty, but as a spiritual reckoning. Even if an assassin survived, they rarely ended their life on their own terms. Illness, malnutrition, exposure, and lingering injuries all contributed to premature death. Few aged gracefully. The reality of living long as a killer was grim. Life extended, but only into hardship. The irony is bitter. Many assassins risked everything to survive early dangers, poison, public attacks, betrayal, and capture only to face a slow, inevitable decline. Death might have been swift for some, but for the survivors, aging was a quiet, unrelenting enemy. It offered no glory, no honor, and no release from past deeds. Some historians note that a few managed to find refuge in monasteries, remote estates, or foreign lands, but these were exceptions. Most assassins were too infamous, too damaged, or too poor to escape the long shadow of their profession. Even distance did not guarantee peace. Reputation traveled, and communities remembered. In the end, aging was more than a personal challenge, it was a systemic one. The profession itself had no safety net, no retirement plan, no community of support. Every year beyond youth increased vulnerability, exposure, and risk. Life became a constant negotiation with mortality, skill, and circumstance. The lesson is stark. Survival in the early years might feel like victory, but longevity in this line of work was almost as dangerous as failure. Aging ensured that every assassin, no matter how skilled, would eventually face limitations, exposure, and often destitution. Death was not the only threat. Life itself could be cruel and exhausting. In many ways, this reflects the harsh arithmetic of medieval survival. Hunger, poverty, danger, and betrayal were constants. Aging merely compounded the costs. There were no heroes, only survivors, and the inevitable toll of time. This grim reality also explains why so few assassins made it to old age. It was not just physical danger that claimed them, it was the slow accumulation of wounds, fatigue, poverty, and social exclusion. Their bodies and minds wore out. The society they had navigated so carefully offered no help, no support, and often no mercy. And yet, some persisted. Against all odds, a few aged assassins lingered. They became ghosts in towns, shadowy figures in villages, quiet reminders of what had passed. Few remembered their names, fewer still celebrated them. The cost of survival was invisibility, poverty, and solitude. In the next chapter, we will ask the central question: if life as an assassin was so dangerous, so isolating, and so short, why did so many still take the risk? Hunger, fear, desperation, and limited options created a world where morality and survival often collided. Because, ultimately, desperation often outweighs fear, and survival rarely waits for wisdom, age, or caution. After everything we've discussed, the poverty, the isolation, the betrayal, the fear of death, and the spiritual weight, it's reasonable to ask a question: why? Why would anyone take up a profession that promised so much danger, so much suffering, and so little reward? The answer is, like much of medieval life, complicated, but it is anchored in one word: survival. For many, assassination was not a career choice. It was a last resort. It was a way to pay debts, feed a family, or avoid starvation. It was not about glory, prestige, or adventure. Those were myths. Reality was far more basic. Hunger does not wait for morality, and desperation does not pause for fear. Imagine a man who has fought in a war, lost land, and owes money he cannot repay. Perhaps he has a wife and children who rely on him. Opportunities are scarce. He has no training, no education, and no social connections that might lead to stable work. A lord offers payment for a deed. The deed is dangerous. It could get him killed, but without it, the family goes hungry. The calculus is grim, and the answer is obvious. Assassins were often pushed into this work by circumstance. Famine, political upheaval, feudal collapse, and war displaced people. Entire communities could be left to starve, and young men often had few options beyond banditry, soldiering, or assassination. It was a world where survival required hard choices, and morality was negotiable. Desperation also explains why some assassins ignored risk. When the alternative was imprisonment, slavery, or starvation, even the most dangerous work seemed preferable. Assassination offered immediate, if risky, rewards. Payment could buy food, shelter, or freedom. Fear of death was always present, but sometimes it was outweighed by more immediate concerns. Another factor was coercion. Some assassins were forced into the role by criminal networks, employers, or debt. They had little agency, little chance to refuse, and little hope of escape. Survival, in these cases, was not just about avoiding death. It was about enduring control and manipulation. Even risk became a necessity. The psychology of desperation is important. Humans tend to weigh immediate survival far more heavily than long-term consequences. Hunger and poverty are concrete. Daily pressures, torture, execution, and spiritual fear are abstract. Future possibilities. For many, the calculation was simple. Act now, live today, worry later. Ironically, some assassins may have felt pride or accomplishment. Successfully carrying out a job meant survival, skill, and resourcefulness. But these feelings were often fleeting, overshadowed by anxiety about betrayal, exposure, or the next job. Survival was never permanent, and every success increased the odds of future danger. The culture of the time reinforced these pressures. Medieval society offered little support to those on the margins. Social mobility was limited. Legal protection was inconsistent. Assistance from the church or guilds was conditional and often inaccessible. For many, risk was unavoidable, and assassination, despite its dangers, provided a way to navigate a harsh and unforgiving world. Some assassins were motivated by opportunity rather than ideology or loyalty. When the chance to make money presented itself, many took it, even knowing the cost. Desperation, greed, and ambition were intertwined. Survival often required taking risks that seem unthinkable from a modern, safe perspective. Even the lessons of others were not always deterrents. Assassins knew peers who were caught, tortured, or killed. Yet the memory of starvation, poverty, and hunger loomed larger than the abstract knowledge of danger. Immediate need outweighed future fear, and the human mind, in extremis, often prioritizes the concrete over the hypothetical. It is also worth noting that social and familial pressure played a role. A man responsible for feeding a family might feel he had no choice. A young man, with no home or prospects, might see assassination as a path to relative security. The weight of responsibility, combined with limited options, pushed people into perilous work. Many also operated within networks. Even if solitary by necessity, assassins often relied on patrons, intermediaries, or criminal contacts. These networks provided opportunities, resources, and minimal protection. Refusing work could mean being cut off from essential survival tools. The choice was rarely free. It was constrained by circumstance. In a way, this explains why morality often seemed flexible. Assassins did not see themselves as villains, they saw themselves as solving immediate problems. Survival required action, even if that action was morally questionable by today's standards. Judgment, when it came, was often delayed until after death or exposure. There is a subtle humor in imagining the medieval assassin weighing morality like a ledger. Food on the table versus eternal damnation. Shelter for children versus exposure to danger. Immediate survival versus abstract fear. Modern audiences may find this ironic or tragic, but for the people living it, the calculation was real and pressing. Some assassins may have sought notoriety, prestige, or influence. A successful job could gain favor with powerful clients, offering potential protection or advancement. But even these benefits were fragile. Reputation could turn against you as quickly as it helped. In most cases, risk exceeded reward, and the social and spiritual costs were enormous. Even knowing the dangers, people still took the work because the alternative was often worse. Starvation, imprisonment, or exposure in a hostile city offered little hope. Survival demanded risk. Fear was constant, but hunger was immediate. Desperation forced action that seems irrational only from a modern, distant perspective. The human element is key. Assassins were not mindless killers or thrill-seekers. They were often ordinary people placed in extraordinary, desperate circumstances. They took jobs to feed themselves, protect families, or escape punishment. They navigated fear, morality, and mortality simultaneously. Their choices were rarely free, but they were necessary. This is why medieval assassination cannot be romanticized. Popular culture loves the image of the clever, fearless killer moving unseen, striking perfectly, and vanishing without consequence. Reality was different. Most assassins lived in constant fear, faced betrayal regularly, and carried burdens that extended beyond themselves to family, community, and soul. And yet, survival drove them. Hunger, poverty, and limited options made the work unavoidable. Fear did not stop them. Death was never far, but life demanded action. Desperation outweighed caution. Survival outweighed morality. And that is the truth. History rarely wrote. In the end, The risk was calculated, but the stakes were enormous. Success meant temporary survival. Failure meant death. Even survival carried social, physical, and spiritual costs. The human element, desperation, fear, and hunger was central. Without it, the story of medieval assassins would make little sense. And so, despite all we've seen, the torture, betrayal, aging, social isolation, and religious fear, people still became assassins, not because they sought danger, glory, or infamy, but because the harsh realities of medieval life left them no real alternative. Survival demanded it, and desperation drove the decision. For the audience, this is the quiet truth. Assassins were human, and human choices are rarely neat, heroic, or moral. They acted out of need, fear, and circumstance. Their lives were short, hard, and full of suffering. Their deaths, when they came, were inevitable, and their stories, when remembered, revealed the cost of living in darkness rather than the thrill of myth. We've walked through the shadows of medieval life, through streets lit only by flickering torches, and into the hidden rooms where assassins made choices no one else would dare. We've seen the poverty that forced men into desperate work, the betrayal that lurked in every corner, and the constant fear of death, torture, exposure, and even God that accompanied every step. Now, as we close this story, it's worth stepping back and asking, what does it all mean? What does history want us to remember? Popular imagination loves assassins. Stories paint them as clever, fearless, almost mythical figures, silent blades in the night, masters of disguise, heroes or anti-heroes whose skill alone keeps them alive. Romance and thrill surround their lives, but the truth is far less glamorous. Most assassins were nameless. Their work was dangerous, their lives short, and their deaths often ignoble. They were not secret geniuses with immaculate precision. They were desperate men, sometimes women, trying to survive in a world that offered them no mercy. Hunger, poverty, social isolation, betrayal, injury, and spiritual fear shaped every day of their lives. Every decision carried the weight of life and death. Violence was rarely elegant. Knives broke, poisons failed, crossbows misfired, plans went wrong, escape was messy, torture was expected, execution was public, and even for those who survived, aging was a slow form of death. Retirement did not exist. Family suffered. Reputation was fragile. Life, in every sense, was expensive. The myths of brotherhoods, elite guilds, and shadowy mystique exist because humans love stories. They need heroes, villains, and clever narratives. But the assassin lived in the ordinary brutality of reality. The silence that surrounded them was not mysterious. It was imposed by fear, risk, and death. Their skill might have been impressive, but it was never enough to shield them from the consequences of their work. Even the exceptional, like the Hashashin, faced enormous costs. Organization, discipline, and ideology prolonged life, but could not eliminate danger. Fear, isolation, and mortality remained. The human element, the fragile, desperate, mortal body, always limited even the most legendary assassin. Religious fear, as we've seen, added another layer. The body might survive, but the soul was always at risk. Confession, absolution, and salvation were not guaranteed. Anxiety, guilt, and dread followed assassins from the first act to the last breath. Their work was never just physical. It was moral, spiritual, and psychological. History tends to remember the victims of violence. Kings, lords, and public figures who fell to blades are recorded in chronicles. Assassins, by contrast, often vanish into the margins. Their suffering, their fear, and their quiet deaths are rarely noted. The cost of being a killer is largely invisible, erased by the very secrecy that enabled their work. The consequence of this erasure is subtle but profound. It allows us, centuries later, to romanticize the work, to imagine clever, fearless shadows moving through foggy streets, when in reality the cost was immense. Life in the shadows was lonely, exhausting, and dangerous. Death was often inevitable. Survival, when achieved, brought little comfort. Even the families of assassins paid the price. Social exile, poverty, and shame often followed. Wives might be abandoned, children barred from trades, and homes confiscated. Violence did not end with the assassin's death. It rippled outward, affecting people who had nothing to do with the work. Life in the shadows was never contained. Its consequences were broad and persistent. And yet, for all this darkness, there is a human story here. Assassins were people, making choices under impossible circumstances. They acted to feed families, survive poverty, or escape coercion. Their morality was constrained by desperation. Their lives were shaped by forces beyond their control. In studying them, we see not only danger and death, but also the resilience, cunning, and courage required to survive even briefly in a harsh world. There is a quiet lesson in this. History is rarely glamorous. Lives that appear exciting, mysterious, or heroic often come at enormous cost. The shadowed figures of the past, forgotten in chronicles or erased by time, remind us that survival is complex, that courage is not always celebrated, and that every life has consequences that ripple outward. For modern audiences, it is tempting to admire assassins for skill, daring, or cunning. But the more instructive perspective is empathy. These were human beings navigating impossible circumstances. Their choices were shaped by poverty, fear, desperation, and mortality. They lived on, died in ways that few of us can imagine. Theirs was not a story of adventure, but of survival. Not of mastery, but of endurance. So, as the candle flickers and the streets of medieval cities fade into memory, it is worth holding that image in mind. The assassin was not a mythic figure or a romantic anti-hero. They were human, vulnerable, desperate, and all too often forgotten. History, when told in quiet tones, allows us to see beyond legend. It lets us understand the cost of violence, the weight of secrecy, and the fragility of life in shadow. The assassin's life was short, hard, and lonely, but it was lived with intention, necessity, and the stark reality of survival. And perhaps that is the most important truth. Life in the shadows was not about glory, thrill, or skill. It was about making choices in a world that offered few options, and bearing the consequences, often alone. Most assassins are nameless. Their deeds vanish into archives, chroniclers' notes, or the gaps between stories. They did not leave monuments. They did not inspire songs. And yet, their lives matter not for fame, but for understanding the human cost of survival, desperation, and life in darkness. So, the next time we think of assassins in history, it is worth remembering the quiet truth. Behind every shadowy figure, there was a human being. Behind every blade, a life constrained by fear, hunger, and mortality. Behind every story, the costs we rarely see, the social, physical, and spiritual tolls that shaped lives, families, and history itself. And finally, it is worth remembering this simple, sobering fact. Survival in the medieval shadows was fleeting. Life as an assassin ended badly more often than it ended well. Fear, betrayal, and mortality were constants. Death was rarely fast. Aging was relentless. Families suffered. And the soul, if one believed, carried a burden that even skill and cunning could not erase. History remembers kings, queens, and public figures. It remembers battles, treaties, and spectacles. But it rarely remembers the cost of becoming the killer. The lives spent in darkness, often ending quietly, painfully, and alone, are mostly forgotten. Their stories remind us that survival is never simple, morality is rarely clear, and the human cost of violence is always profound. The medieval assassin, then, is not a figure to glorify. They are a cautionary tale. They are a reminder of desperation, risk, and the shadowed human experience. And in their quiet, often nameless existence, they reveal truths about history we would otherwise ignore. The cost of survival, the weight of fear, and the price of living and dying in the shadows. And so, as the candle burns low and the city sleeps, we leave the assassin where history often leaves them, nameless, lonely, and quietly bearing the cost of survival. Their story is dark, uncomfortable, and rarely told, but it is real. And perhaps, in that quiet truth, there is a lesson worth remembering. Being a medieval assassin wasn't a life of power or prestige, it was a life of fear, isolation, and constant risk. No safety, no recognition, no escape, just survival, secrecy, and a world that would erase you the moment you failed. History often turns these figures into legends, but behind the myth were real human beings trapped in lives they didn't choose, walking paths that offered no peace and no future. If this story gave you a new perspective on the darker side of medieval life, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this hidden world shocked you the most? And if you want more calm, immersive stories that reveal what history usually leaves out, check out the related videos on the channel, from forgotten professions to lives lived in the shadows. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for exploring history with me. Until the next story, stay curious and stay human.